There is a shelf in these lower stacks that dislikes being opened. Do not give me that expression. I am aware shelves do not possess temperaments in the ordinary sense. Most shelves are loyal servants of burden and geometry. They hold what they are given, sag honestly when abused, and complain only through dust, warped wood, and the occasional theatrical collapse upon an apprentice who has mistaken enthusiasm for structural assessment. Yet this one here, behind the iron-bound cabinet of early Vilhonais trade records, has always seemed reluctant. Perhaps it is the damp. Perhaps it is the lingering salt preserved in ledgers that should never have known the sea. Or perhaps wood, like stone, remembers what was drowned. Welcome back to the Hidden Stacks. I am Irillian Cantonine, Baelnorn Law Warden, keeper of old roads, old griefs, and old corrections, sworn to preserve what survives the vanity of conquerors and the tidiness of later summaries. This is the Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. Last time we opened the second season by refusing the great lie of emptiness. We considered Faerûn after the elder catastrophes, after the days of thunder, after the first flowering, after the crown wars, after the breaking of old orders whose ruins did not vanish simply because their banners fell. We asked who inherits the ruins. We noticed, as sensible people must eventually notice, that almost no kingdom in Faerûn begins upon blank earth. Someone was there before. Someone cut the first road. Someone named the river. Someone raised the wall that later farmers used as a quarry. Someone prayed at the spring before a temple of a newer god declared it sanctified. Someone died beneath the field before the field became taxable. That was the first principle of this season. Civilization in Faerûn is almost always secondary occupation. Tonight, we turn from principle to example. Not to Netheril, not yet. Netheril is loud enough that it need not be invited early. If one says the word arcanist in a candle-lit room, some fragment of Netherese pride will usually arrive unbidden, wearing too much gold and explaining why gravity is an inferior custom. Nor do we turn to Imaskar, that most bureaucratically gifted of kidnappers, though its shadow lies across much of what came later. Nor do we begin with Mulhorand or Unther, where gods became administration and temple became state. No. Tonight we descend toward the Vilhon. We speak of Jhaamdath, the empire of the mind. Jhaamdath is one of those names that tests the sincerity of a scholar. Say Netheril, and even tavern-brave youths nod as if they personally inspected the falling enclaves. Say Mithdrano, and half the room becomes misty-eyed, usually with incomplete information. Say Thay, and someone reaches for either a warding charm or a business opportunity, depending on moral quality. Say Jhaamdath, and a silence falls, not the silence of ignorance alone. The stranger silence of a thing too important to fit comfortably into the popular arrangement of memory. For Jhaamdath was great, not merely old, not merely large, great. It was an early human power in the lands that would later be called the Vilhon Reach. It endured for millennia. It built cities, armies, fleets, laws, institutions, written habits, trade networks, and a culture so influential that the tongues of later humans carried its bones forward after its towers drowned. It was, in the old classification, a psiocracy, a realm governed by those who mastered the invisible art, the disciplined power of the mind. That alone should make you sit straighter. The great human empires of Faerûn were not all arcane. They did not all discover a scroll, bind a mythala, open a portal, steal a people, crown a god-king, or name themselves masters of the weave. Some built power out of thought itself. Some made concentration into hierarchy. Some turned inward discipline into outward rule. Some looked at the flesh, the city, the shipyard, the court, the battlefield, the school, the law, and said, all of these are crude unless the mind is ordered first. A dangerous proposition. Also a seductive one. Before we proceed, a word from those currently paying for a portion of these candles, whose ledgers, unlike several empires I could name, appear to balance without requiring forced migration or a divine correction. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you require a website, application, system, or digital structure built with clarity, maintainability, and the blessed humility to remember that future users are not hypothetical abstractions, but real creatures with deadlines and opinions, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. Dharma Web Solutions builds practical, durable web solutions for mortals who would prefer their infrastructure not behave like a late Netherese enclave or a Jhaamdath artifact leaking mental residue into the local fish. A good system should support thought, not devour it. This is true of cities, archives, and websites. Now, back to the drowned empire. To understand Jhaamdath, you must first unlearn the modern map. The Vilhon Reach, as later sailors know it, did not always possess its familiar shape. Maps are liars even when they tell the truth, because they persuade the eye that the present coastline is a permanent fact. It is not. Coastlines are agreements between stone and water, and the gods, dragons, elves, arcanists, elemental powers, and imprudent mortals of Faerûn have never been shy about renegotiating agreements. In the ancient era of Jhaamdath, before the Year of Furious Waves, the region was not the Reach, as later merchants and pirates would know it. There was a bay, there were riverlands, there were fertile stretches north of the great forest remembered as Nikarimath, the wood that later ages would know through the long inheritance of the Condlewood. There were uplands, mountains, roads not yet famous, and communities whose own names survive poorly or not at all because empires are greedy even in memory. To the north and east lay the broader sea of fallen stars, that inland ocean which would become one of the great engines of Faerûnian history. To the south, forest. To the west and southwest, routes toward older southern powers. To the east, lands that would, in time, know other human ambitions and older divine claims. This geography mattered. A river valley and bay teach different lessons than an inland plateau. They teach movement. They teach shipbuilding. They teach the value of ports before the portmaster learns to flatter himself. They teach that wealth travels by water more cheaply than by road, and that ideas, sailors, spies, diseases, refugees, weapons, and songs tend to travel along the same currents. They also teach appetite. A people with good harbors soon discovers that the horizon is a form of temptation. Jhaamdath began, in the broad reckoning preserved by later annals, around -5,800 Dala reckoning. We are deep before the Standing Stone, deep before the Dala lands, deep before Cormyr, Waterdeep, Sembia, the familiar north, and most of the political furniture later ages mistake for permanence. human settlements in the region were drawn together under a warrior king remembered as Jhaam, a psionic warrior of enough force that his name clung to dynasty and realm. His unification of neighboring villages is sometimes described in defensive terms as an attempt to secure a young realm from attack. One should not scoff. Many empires begin as defensive arrangements. This does not make their later expansion innocent. It merely reminds us that fear often lays the first stones that pride later claims as monuments. The name Jhaamdath itself carries that founder's echo, Jhaamdath, a man, a line, a realm. Such things please royal scribes. They suggest continuity where history usually offers negotiation, bloodshed, hunger, marriage, compromise, and the useful accident of being less dead than one's rivals. Soon after, around -5750 Dala reckoning, the first great city of the realm was founded. Here the records grow irritatingly instructive, which is to say they disagree. Some strong printed traditions name Dinilith as the first city of the sword and capital of Jhaamdath. Other chronological traditions give the chief place to Narkalith and preserve Dinilith in a stranger relation, a protected or elusive space connected to that city's palace and memory. I will not force agreement where the records do not provide it. It is enough for us to know that the early capital tradition centers upon the first city of the sword, and that later lore remembers its name or double name with the uneasy shimmer common to cities that refuse to be wholly dead. A lesser narrator would smooth that out. A useful narrator tells you where the parchment buckles. From such beginnings, the realm changed, not merely by adding walls, fields, and officials, but by discovering or cultivating a form of power, unlike the arcane empires that dominate so many later retellings. Psionics, the invisible art, mind as force, discipline, perception, defense, movement, command, and transformation. Let us pause over that phrase, the invisible art. It is easy for those raised amid ordinary spellcraft to misunderstand psionic power. A wizard keeps books, components, formulae, sigils, gestures, grammar. A cleric calls through faith, office, covenant, devotion, or divine arrangement. A warlock negotiates, bargains, inherits, steals, or is marked. A druid listens to older rhythms of beast, season, stone, and storm. A sorcerer carries catastrophe or ancestry in the blood. These descriptions are never complete, but they are useful enough for first sorting. The scion turns inward. Not inward in the sentimental manner of minor philosophers who mistake private discomfort for cosmic revelation. Inward as a discipline. Inward as a blade returns to whetstone. Inward as a fortress closes its gates and orders the watch. Thought is trained until thought becomes instrument. Perception is refined until the mind can touch what the hand cannot. Will is hardened until distance, matter, sensation, pain, and fear become negotiable. That sort of power changes a society differently than spellcraft does. Arcane magic tends to create guilds, schools, apprentice lineages, secrecy around formula, and struggles over access to texts. Divine magic tends to create temples, hierarchies, rituals, sacred calendars, laws of purity and transgression, and public legitimacy. Psionics creates another pressure. It asks who is disciplined enough, who is gifted enough, who is balanced enough. who can enter the silence and return with power? Who can be trusted with abilities that may leave fewer visible traces than fireball and fewer witnesses than a sword? If you build a state around that, you build a state around evaluation of the mind. Be wary. Jhaamdath did not become a theocracy all at once. Early power seems to have passed through oligarchic forms, warrior leadership, dynasty, practical unification, and the familiar ugliness of regional consolidation. Then came one of the crucial figures in its transformation. Lich Silvermind, a psionic mystic and devotee of Alpenser, the Lord of Reason, the Serene One, the master of the invisible art. Around -5730 Dala reckoning, the old accounts say Alpenser spoke through Lich and offered the people of Jhaamdath a plan for prosperity. Whether one imagines divine revelation, inspired reform, political theatre supported by genuine power, or some mixture of all three depends partly on temperament and partly on one's willingness to admit that gods in Faerûn have a distressing habit of making political theory more literal than scholars prefer. The first great directive preserved in later chronicle was the abolition of slavery within Jhaamdath. Yes, you heard correctly. The empire whose later armies would commit horrors began one of its great reforming moments by outlawing slavery. Sit with that, my apprentice. It is good for the moral joints. History is unkind to simple categories, and rightly so. A society can abolish one evil and cultivate another. A ruler can issue a just law and prepare unjust wars. A temple can teach self-reflection while blessing hierarchy. A people can be more humane than their neighbors in one custom and more cruel in another. When later bards prefer clean verdicts, they do so because clean verdicts require less room on the page. Jhaamdath's early psionic order carried genuine ideals: moderation, inner balance, self-reflection, reason, personal autonomy, at least in the religious language of Alpenser's cult. These are not contemptible things. A civilization that tries to train its citizens against impulse has seen something true about mortal danger. Most atrocities begin with ungoverned appetite, then higher rhetoric afterward. Alpenser's discipline promised restraint. It promised inward mastery. It promised a state guided by thought rather than whim. Yet discipline enthroned becomes surveillance. Reason weaponized becomes contempt for those deemed irrational. Inner balance institutionalized becomes a scale held by the powerful and placed upon the necks of the weak. Again, seductive ideas arrive well-dressed. Lich's reforms did not end with proclamation. Around -5725 Dala reckoning, he is credited in later history with fashioning the first of the Eudoxias, a psionic artifact of enormous importance to Jhaamdathan culture. The surviving descriptions vary in fullness, and some of the richer traditions come to us through expanded authorial lore rather than every printed page of the primary annals, so we must tread carefully. But the central idea is clear enough. These devices stored, focused, or bestowed access to psionic power for those able to make mental contact with them. Their influence could extend beyond a single chamber, touching the life of a city. Imagine such a thing. Not a wizard's tower where one old man with ink on his cuffs guards a shelf of formulae, not a temple where a god's favor descends through ordained hands alone. A public or semi-public psionic engine, a stone of insight, a reservoir of mental technique, an artifact around which education, authority, ritual, and urban design might gather. If the Mithalar later allowed Netheril to make magic an infrastructure of floating cities, the Eudoxias allowed Jhaamdath to imagine discipline of mind as a civic utility. What does that do to a city? It changes childhood. It changes ambition. It changes shame. A child in such a city may be watched not only for strong arms, noble blood, clever fingers, or a pleasing voice, but for focus, for silence, for the ability to hold a thought without it fluttering away like a tavern moth. Lessons become tests of memory, concentration, pain control, emotional regulation, telepathic sensitivity, resistance to intrusion, and perhaps the ethical handling of what one perceives. Play changes when some children can move a cup without touching it, sense a lie before language catches it, or hear impressions that others cannot. Cruelty changes too. Childhood cruelty always finds the available tools. It changes family status. In an ordinary hereditary aristocracy, blood excuses stupidity for an astonishing length of time. In a mercantile oligarchy, coin can launder vulgarity into taste by the second generation. In a psiocracy, mental ability becomes title, or at least the road to title. That sounds meritocratic, until one remembers that every meritocracy first chooses which merits count, then pretends the choice was made by nature. The disciplined mind becomes sacred. The undisciplined mind becomes suspect. Those without talent, or without access to training, or without the right lineage of teachers find themselves described not merely as poor, but as lesser instruments of civilization. It changes law. If truth can be approached through mental discipline, what becomes of testimony? If a trained mind can resist coercion better than an untrained one, whose word carries weight? If emotion is treated as imbalance, what happens to grief in court? If certain officials can perceive intention more sharply than ordinary magistrates, does law become fairer, or does it become tyranny with a calm voice? Would a Jhaamdathan judge distrust tears? Would a blade lord consider anger evidence of guilt? Would the poor learn to keep their thoughts still in public even when no scion was listening, because power teaches manners long before it issues laws? We cannot answer every question from surviving records, but we can understand the pressures. Around minus 5,710 Dala reckoning, Lazic established the Eudoclian, remembered as a university or institution devoted to teaching and promoting the invisible art. Here we begin to see the architecture of endurance. A gifted founder can astonish a generation. An institution trains the next. The difference between marvel and civilization is whether the practice can be transmitted after the charismatic figure vanishes, dies, ascends, is murdered, or becomes too inconvenient for the people who turned him into a statue. By around minus 5,700 Dala reckoning, Jhaamdath had set aside its earlier oligarchic government in favor of a psiocratic order. The ruling elite of scions and psychic warriors were remembered as blade lords. Note the word. Not mind lords, not serene contemplatives, blade lords. Jhaamdath never forgot steel. This is essential. The empire of the mind was not a monastery that accidentally acquired borders. It was a martial state. Its cities were cities of the sword. Its warrior tradition and psionic discipline were bound together. Its elites valued the perfection of body and mind. Opensa's balance did not reject violence. It sought to order it. That may be better than savagery. It may also be more efficient than savagery, which is not always an improvement. When later historians speak of Jhaamdath as the 12 cities of the sword, they are not indulging in poetic excess. The realm's identity fused urban pride, martial skill, and psionic governance. Swordsmanship remained famous among the Jhaamdathan people. The blade was symbol, practical tool, military discipline, civic badge, and perhaps a reminder that thought, however refined, still wanted an edge. I have known many civilizations that claimed to be guided by reason. The armory was always full. Let us dwell in one of those cities for a moment, not because the records grant us every street name, but because institutions become real only when we imagine how they touched hands, meals, doors, and wages. Mourning in a Jhaamdathan city would not sound like mourning in Mithdrana, Netheril, Kalimport, or a dwarven hold beneath the mountains. The old city wakes under banners of the sword, under temple eyes of Opensa, under the quiet social pressure of a culture that honors focus. There are markets because even scions require grain, oil, salt, cloth, beer, timber, ink, and someone to repair sandals. There are smiths because blade lords do not meditate enemies to death in every circumstance, whatever young adepts may have claimed after too little sleep. There are scribes because the mind may be trained, but taxation still prefers marks on a surface. There are schools, temples, barracks, docks, counting houses, and households arranged by rank, duty, and access to instruction. The difference lies in what people admire. In Waterdeep, a person may admire wit, wealth, audacity, lineage, beauty, a good scandal, or the ability to survive 3 guild hearings without visibly aging. In Cormyr, at least in its healthier moments, one admires service, loyalty to crown, honorable conduct, courage under law, and the ability to endure noble relatives without treason. In Thay, one admires power while pretending to admire learning. In early Jhaamdath, the ideal was composure sharpened into capacity. The good student does not merely memorize. She holds silence. The good soldier does not merely swing. He anticipates. The good magistrate does not merely judge. He perceives the disorder beneath the action. The good citizen does not merely obey. She regulates herself before the state must do it for her. There is the hinge. Every state teaches habits. The question is whether those habits make the soul larger or merely easier to govern. Jhaamdathan society is remembered as highly regimented, with a caste structure usually given in descending order as sciarchs, soldiers, scribes, and commoners. Even if local practice shifted over millennia, the hierarchy tells us much. At the top were the mind-trained rulers and priestly or philosophical elites, those who embodied the state's highest claim about itself. Below them stood the armed class, for Jhaamdath never separated mind from war for long. Then scribes, the keepers of record, administration, communication, and legal continuity. Then commoners, the broad base upon whom the city's appetite rested. Do not treat those categories as inert. A caste system is not only a list of social ranks, it is an instruction manual for expectation. A child of Syark families is expected to show discipline early. Failure is not private disappointment, it is civic embarrassment. A soldier's household learns honor through obedience and readiness. A scribe's child learns that memory properly formatted can influence power from below, or at least survive it. A commoner's child learns that labor supports serenity, preached by people with cleaner hands. And across all castes, the ideology of the mind provides justification. If you are above, your mind is more ordered. If you are below, perhaps you lack training, talent, balance, or proof. A society need not say the cruel thing aloud once it has arranged every institution to imply it. Yet it would be unjust to make Jhaamdath only a tyranny of thought. It was also a culture of extraordinary achievement. Written language mattered there. Its language, remembered as Jhaamdathan or Old Chondathan, became part of the Central Thoras inheritance. Later, Chondathan descended from it, and the old trade tongue Thoras drew from Jhaamdathan and Alzedo. If you listen carefully to the later speech of merchants, settlers, nobles, soldiers, and wanderers across broad portions of Faerûn, you may hear the drowned empire still moving under the grammar. Language is one of history's most successful ghosts. A tower may fall, a harbour may silt, a dynasty may end in murder, debt, or a scandal involving 3 heirs and 1 suspiciously literate horse. But a word survives in a farmer's oath. A case ending survives in a merchant's contract. A proverb survives because grandmothers are harder to conquer than border forts. Jhaamdath died beneath water, but its linguistic descendants helped shape how later humans traded, negotiated, named, insulted, promised, and lied. There are empires that survive because their descendants keep the crown. There are better empires, or at least more durable ones, that survive because strangers use their verbs. The old language matters for another reason. Psionic cultures often leave difficult evidence. A spell book can be copied. A temple wall can be read if the alphabet is known, and the priesthood's symbolism has not become too insufferable. A sword can be measured, a coin weighed, a road followed. But mental disciplines are partly embodied practice. They live in teacher and student, in exercises, habits, trance states, moral vocabulary, training sequences, and tacit corrections. When the line of instruction is broken, the ruin left behind may not explain itself. Later, looters may find a crystal, a chamber, a blade, a polished stone, a circle of seats, a smooth wall marked with geometric signs, and call it treasure, shrine, classroom, prison, or trap, according to which mistake seems most profitable. This is why Jhaamdath is both fascinating and elusive. Netheril left enough arrogant stone and spectacular disaster that even an inattentive historian can follow the falling debris. Imaskar left planar scars, Imaskar and the enormous moral crater of stolen peoples. Mulhorand and Unther made themselves legible through divine administration. Jhaamdath left cities underwater, mental artifacts whose workings do not politely translate into ordinary arcane categories, and descendants who often forgot that their common habits were built atop a drowned psychic state. The mind is difficult to excavate. One may dig up a helmet. One cannot easily dig up the discipline that taught the helmet's wearer when to fear, when to focus, when to obey, and when to kill. Now consider the Eudoxias again. The word itself appears to preserve the old root associated with insight. Later descriptions speak of great psionic receptacles or artifacts, sometimes imagined as immense gemstones, storing powers and allowing those in mental contact to access them. Even if we keep to the more restrained records, their function within the story of Jhaamdath is clear. They gave the invisible art a civic center. They made psionic power not merely a private gift, but a public institution. I have seen this pattern elsewhere. When a power begins as personal talent, it produces heroes, monsters, saints, frauds, hermits, and prodigies. When that power becomes teachable, it produces schools. When schools become linked to office, it produces class. When class becomes law, it produces a state. When the state sanctifies the arrangement, it produces history's favorite disaster: people confusing the current hierarchy with cosmic order. Jhaamdath's psionic institutions likely functioned along several axes: training naturally, selection inevitably, storage of technique if the Eudoxias are understood as repositories, religious legitimation through Alpenser, military application through the Blade Lords and psychic warriors, administrative application through disciplined communication, record, and control, civic identity through the cities of the sword, social reproduction through caste and education. There is a certain elegance in it. This is why it is dangerous. Bad systems often survive because they are useful to someone powerful. Sophisticated systems survive because they are useful to almost everyone in some measure while quietly devouring the margin of choice. A commoner in Jhaamdath may have benefited from order, roads, protection, trade, abolition of slavery, access to temple discipline, predictable courts, and the prestige of belonging to a great civilization. That same commoner may also have lived beneath a structure that taught him his mind was socially inferior before any official had to say so. Both truths can occupy the same household. Do not imagine empire as a villain's cloak draped over an unwilling population. Empire is more intimate than that. It arrives as safety after raids, as standard weights, as wider markets, as roads through hills, as courts where feuds need not become family wars, as schools for gifted children, as soldiers on the frontier, as grain reserves in a bad season, as pride when foreigners speak your city's name with caution. Then slowly it becomes the assumption that other peoples would be better if they submitted to your version of order. Jhaamdath expanded. Of course it expanded. A secure valley does not remain a secure valley once its elites learn that the surrounding world contains resources, rival powers, forests for ship timber, trade routes, ports, peoples to absorb, and frontiers upon which ambitious younger sons may make reputations. The early human settlements united for security. The realm's psionic institutions matured. Cities multiplied. The 12 cities of the sword became both political reality and civilizational brand. Dinilith or Narcolith, depending on the strand of record. Poranath, Juram, Garent, Golmuth, Lirimar, Tuoxent, Holinth, Girent, Inixian, Corant, Mirindith, names now mostly broken, drowned, intermittent or preserved in lists that feel like stones counted on a funeral cloth. Some of those names may mean little to a modern listener. That is part of the grief. Each was once not merely a name, but a mourning, a market, a court, A gate, a gossip's preferred corner, a temple's ceiling, a barrack smell, a child's route to instruction, a cook's complaint about military requisitions, a dockworker's bad knee, a Syarch's ceremonial calm while furious beneath the skin, a scribe's ink-stained thumb, a soldier sharpening a blade while repeating a focusing exercise learned from his mother, a commoner wondering whether the empire's serenity would ever reach the price of bread. Then the list becomes archaeology. That is what drowning does to civic complexity. It makes all distinctions equally silent to those who do not care enough to listen. At its height, Jhaamdath's influence stretched broadly through south-central Faerûn and around the southern shores of the Inner Sea. Later summaries speak of reach westward toward Corruption, southward toward the Great Rift, and eastward into lands that would belong to other later histories. It interacted with powers older and younger than itself. It collided with the ancestral dynamics of Calimshan's formation, with the politics of the Lake of Steam, with the human and non-human peoples of the south and east, and with forest realms that did not appreciate being turned into timber policy. The conflict with Mir and Corruption around the early 5th millennium before Dala Reckoning is one of those moments that reveals the region's future. Jhaamdath pressed toward the Lake of Steam. The kingdoms of Mir and Corruption responded in ways that helped solidify Calimshan as a greater power. Here again, geography speaks. Inland water, trade routes, forests and ports draw states into conflict because they are too useful to leave alone. A psionic empire and a genie-haunted southern realm do not require ideological hatred to fight. A valuable route will do. Over time, Jhaamdath also entered periods of stagnation. Some records speak of long centuries in which expansion slowed, xenophobia hardened, and outside pressures, including the rise and influence of Untha, constrained Jhaamdathan ambition. This should not surprise us. Millennia-old states do not remain equally energetic throughout their lives. They breathe, they swell, tighten, decay, reform, become suspicious, reopen, panic, recover, and lie about all of it in commemorative inscriptions. Stagnation is not peace. Stagnation is a society keeping its shape while forgetting why the shape was chosen. This is where the early ideals of Alpensa become especially interesting. Moderation and inner balance can preserve a civilization from impulse. They can also become excuses for withdrawal. A society that prizes inward control may come to distrust the disorder of foreigners, the improvisation of frontier peoples, the religious eccentricities of neighbors, the unruly fertility of forests, the unprocessed grief of conquered subjects, and the undisciplined laughter of those who have not been properly ranked. An orderly people can become afraid of life. When such a people turns outward again, it may do so not with curiosity, but with corrective zeal. Before we follow Jhaamdath toward its last violence, we must speak more deeply of psionics as statecraft, because this is the heart of the episode. It is not enough to say Jhaamdath was ruled by scions and then move along, as if replacing crowns with crystals explains anything. What matters is how mental power would alter the ordinary mechanisms of rule. Begin with communication. A state lives or dies by the movement of information. Roads matter because messengers use them. Ports matter because news comes with cargo. Scribes matter because memory must survive the death or inconvenience of the eyewitness. In a psionic culture, certain forms of communication may become swifter, more intimate, or more secure among trained elites. Even without imagining every Blade Lord casually conversing across impossible distances, the existence of telepathic disciplines changes expectations. A council may value silence because silence is not absence of communication. A military command may include mental signaling at critical moments. Diplomatic envoys may be chosen for resistance to intrusion as much as eloquence. Spies may fear interrogation not only by pain, but by presence. This does not eliminate bureaucracy. Nothing eliminates bureaucracy except catastrophe, and catastrophe usually produces a worse one afterward. But psionics could create parallel channels, formal orders in writing for the archive, mental confirmation for speed, ritualized disciplines to verify identity, trained guards against manipulation, examinations not only of literacy and law, but of will. Next, law. Every legal system has a theory of the person. Is the person an oath maker before gods, a subject of the crown, a member of a clan, a holder of property, a soul accountable for sin, a body to be punished, a mind capable of intention? Jhaamdath, by elevating mental discipline, likely made intention central. The disciplined mind was morally and politically significant. This could produce more careful judgments in some cases. It might distinguish accident from malice with greater subtlety. It might produce methods for detecting coercion, possession, enchantment, or panic. But it also risks a terrible arrogance. The belief that an ordered mind is inherently more truthful, more deserving, more fully civic. Those who grieve loudly become suspect. Those with trauma become unreliable. Those whose customs prize ecstatic worship, communal trance, spontaneous song, battle fury, or prophetic frenzy may be dismissed as unbalanced. Foreign cultures become evidence of mental inferiority. Poverty becomes a failure of discipline. Rebellion becomes pathology. Dissent becomes disorder. You see the danger. The mind as legal object is easily treated as territory. Now, education. A psionic state must locate talent. It must train it, classify it, promote it, restrain it, and prevent unsanctioned power from blooming outside official structures. Thus, schools are not merely benevolent, they are nets. The Udoklion, if we understand it as the great institution of psionic learning, would have been an engine of mobility for some and capture for others. A gifted commoner might rise. A gifted conquered child might be absorbed. A noble child without talent might be humiliated or shunted sideways into soldierly, scribal, or ceremonial roles. Talent in such a system is never private. It belongs, sooner or later, to the realm. The state that discovers your gift will often call that discovery an honor. It may be. It may also be conscription with better robes. Now, warfare. Jhaamdath's martial reputation was not ornamental. A psionic army is not simply an army whose officers have unusual tricks. It is an army whose training can emphasize mental resilience, coordination, fear control, perception, and sudden focused violence. Psychic warriors alter the battlefield's tempo. Blade Lords can serve as commanders, champions, interrogators, scouts, duelists, and symbols. A soldier trained under psionic doctrine may learn to act while terrified, to resist confusion, to obey silent signals, to push past pain, and to believe that the Empire's order is not merely political, but inwardly superior. Such soldiers are formidable. They are also susceptible to the oldest military disease. Believing discipline proves righteousness. Jhaamdath maintained standing forces and drew warriors from outer provinces. This matters because empires often fight with the bodies of people not fully admitted into the imperial self-image. Provincial troops may receive coin, status, survival, and a place in the machine. They may also be used to extend a center that looks down upon them. Jhaamdath absorbed conquered peoples rather than always destroying or enslaving them, and in this it differed from more crudely annihilating powers. But absorption can be a kind of conquest that smiles. The Turami of the Akanal Hills, for instance, are remembered as being brought into Jhaamdathan society in a lower laboring position. The empire could congratulate itself on not erasing them while arranging them beneath the people who made the laws. A softer conquest is still conquest if the conquered never get to define softness. Now, religion. Opensa's place in Jhaamdath is not incidental. The god of the invisible art, serenity, reason, personal autonomy, and balance gave sacred shape to psionic society. This is a profound difference from a secular academy of mentalists. The state did not simply reward focus, it sanctified it. The disciplined mind reflected divine favor, or at least divine order. The temple and training hall could reinforce one another. Priests, scions, blade lords, and philosophers would argue, no doubt, as all specialists do when locked in proximity with prestige. But their shared assumption was powerful. Jhaamdath's greatness was not an accident. It was aligned with reason itself. Reason itself. There is a phrase that has justified more cruelty than rage ever managed alone. Rage burns out. Reason writes policy. I do not say Opensa commanded every later imperial crime. The records do not support such vulgarity, and gods, even when deeply involved, are not always responsible for what worshippers do with convenient fragments of doctrine. Indeed, Alpensa's early precepts included abolition of slavery, and his ideal of moderation may have restrained Jhaamdath's worst appetites for long ages. But a god's teaching enters human institutions through human ambition. Serenity becomes court etiquette. Balance becomes class order. Self-reflection becomes supervised conformity. Reason becomes the voice used by those who have already decided. A god may offer a lamp. A state may turn it into an interrogation light. There is another matter to consider, one often neglected by those who treat psionics as merely a different list of powers. Privacy. Every civilization draws a boundary between the self and the public world. That boundary is never absolute. A king's tax collector, a priest's confessor, a guildmaster's ledger, a spouse's intuition, a neighbor's gossip, and a bard's regrettable eyesight all intrude upon the private life. Yet the mind remains, for most peoples, the last chamber. You may be watched, commanded, searched, tempted, and judged, but your unspoken thought retains a kind of inner sovereignty. A psionic society complicates that sovereignty. I'm not saying Jhaamdathan officials read every mind in every market. Do not be childish. Power does not need total application to alter behavior. It need only be possible, prestigious, and unevenly accountable. If a citizen believes the elite may perceive more than ordinary senses allow, the citizen learns a public composure deeper than etiquette. He learns to discipline not only action and speech, but perhaps even the face of thought. Whether his fear is always justified matters less than whether the fear becomes social habit. This is how psychic power becomes statecraft without being used at every meal. People anticipate it. The commoner before a magistrate wonders whether his anger can be sensed. The soldier before a blade lord wonders whether fear marks him. The provincial envoy wonders whether his rehearsed lies are thick enough. The child in training wonders whether failure is visible before she speaks. The dissident wonders whether secrecy is still possible, or whether resistance must be organized through signs, songs, coded trade, religious ecstasy, or communities too lowly to interest the psyarchs until it is too late. All empires produce countercultures in the shape of what they overvalue. A merchant empire produces smugglers. A temple state produces heretics. A warrior aristocracy produces assassins. A psionic state must produce arts of hiddenness. We know too little of Jhaamdath's internal descent. This absence itself is suggestive, though one must not lean upon absence until it breaks. Perhaps the victorious systems preserved their own records and drowned the rest. Perhaps the flood erased evidence. Perhaps later descendants preferred founding myths to complicated internal archives. Perhaps the state was less oppressive in practice than its structure allows us to imagine. We must leave room for uncertainty. Still, I ask you, in an empire of the mind, where does rebellion hide? In the body? In labor? In jokes? In ritual too irrational for officials to pass? In foreign marriages? In market songs? In the refusal to show talent? In the deliberate cultivation of being underestimated? There are no ruins more difficult to excavate than unwritten resistance. Now, let us widen the lens. Jhaamdath was not alone in the world. No empire is, though every empire develops a regrettable tendency to speak as if it was surrounded by raw material and weather. To the south lay the forest of Nikerimath, ancient, inhabited, and not impressed by human classifications of useful timber. To the wider south and west, the complicated histories of Khorramshan, Mir, Kalimshan, and the Lake of Steam were taking shape. To the east and beyond, other human and non-human peoples moved through older geographies. Beneath the waters of the inner sea, the sea-elven realm of Aris El Malir possessed its own history, its own cities, and its own doom, waiting unconsulted below. This last point matters later. A surface empire rarely understands the underwater empire it is about to help destroy by provoking someone else's magic. There is a lesson there for all who act grandly upon partial maps. The 12 cities of the sword were situated within a landscape already layered with claims. The forest elves of Nikerimath were not decorative obstacles. They were peoples with homes, sacred groves, hunting paths, histories, dead, songs, and reasons to mistrust human expansion. If you have followed our earlier accounts of the Crown Wars, you know elves are not innocents given pointed ears. They can be proud, cruel, isolationist, subtle, and catastrophically certain. Yet in the case of Jhaamdath's final aggression, the elven fear was not conjured from nothing. The Jhaamdathan turned toward imperial expansion, brought axes, ships, armies, and slaughter to their doorstep. Let us not make the old error of choosing one villain so that everyone else may remain clean. The elves of Nicerimath were defending themselves from annihilation. They also chose a defense that annihilated cities. Both statements must stand. Before that final flood, however, there were centuries upon centuries of Jhaamdathan development. It is worth asking why the empire endured so long. Psionic power alone does not explain it. Many powerful things die quickly because power without structure is fireworks over a plague pit, impressive, brief, and usually followed by coughing. Jhaamdath endured because it paired power with repeatable systems. It had cities. A city is more than population concentration. A city is a device for organizing surplus and argument. It gathers labor, protects specialization, concentrates memory, and creates the kind of density in which institutions can survive succession. The 12 cities were not merely trophies. They were nodes in a network of governance, military provisioning, religious life, training, trade, and identity. It had a state religion capable of explaining the social order. Explanation is one of power's favorite meals. People can endure many hardships if given a convincing story in which endurance has meaning. Opensa's doctrine could frame discipline as sacred and hierarchy as the practical arrangement of different degrees of mastery. It could restrain cruelty when cruelty appeared as imbalance. It could excuse cruelty when cruelty appeared as correction. It had a martial elite, the Blade Lords, embodying both thought and force. This prevented the division that destroys some intellectual regimes, where scholars command soldiers who despise them, or soldiers rule scholars they do not understand. In Jhaamdath, at least ideally, the sword and the mind were in the same hand. It had scribes. Never neglect scribes. A civilization that produces magnificent warriors but cannot record grain shipments is a bonfire with better posture. Scribes connect tax, law, inheritance, military supply, memory, treaty, census, and ideology. In a psionic empire, they also mark the boundary between inner knowledge and public record. Not everything can be held in mind, not even by science. The archive is civilization admitting it will forget. It had commoners, every empire does. Commoners are the ground upon which elite theory stands while pretending to levitate. Farmers, fishers, haulers, masons, sailors, potters, weavers, brewers, charcoal burners, servants, apprentices, street vendors, wet nurses, healers, stable hands, grave diggers, dock workers, and all the unglamorous persons without whom the most refined Blade Lord becomes a hungry man in ceremonial clothing. If Jhaamdath's elites trained their minds, its commoners trained endurance. It had trade. The bay and river system, later the transformed Reach, placed Jhaamdath in relation to the broader inner sea. Trade does not merely move goods, it imports comparison. A citizen who has never seen another legal system assumes his own is nature. A sailor knows better. Merchants bring foreign coin, foreign insults, foreign gods, foreign measurements, foreign diseases, and foreign excuses for why payment will be delayed. Trade is empire's servant and infection. And it had memory of founding, Charm, Lazik, Aupensa's plan, the cities of the sword. These gave the society a narrative of chosen order, a people who believed their institutions emerged from divine reason and disciplined necessity do not easily question whether the same institutions have become swollen, predatory, or afraid. This is why reforms must themselves be judged by time. A reform can save a century and endanger the next millennium. By the late centuries before Jhaamdath's destruction, the empire appears to have suffered from the diseases common to old powers: stagnation, xenophobia, elite rigidity, a grand self-image no longer matched by creative vitality. A political structure in which inherited prestige and psionic legitimacy may have become too heavy to adapt gracefully. Then, as if history desired a final demonstration of its sour humor, Jhaamdath was seized by renewed expansionist force. Around -276 Dala reckoning, a powerful metamind named Darian overthrew the old Blade Lords and declared himself emperor. The shift from Siocratic Council to imperial singularity is not a small administrative detail. It is the empire changing its answer to the question of authority. A council of Blade Lords says, mastery is distributed among the disciplined elite. An emperor says, mastery has a face. There are advantages to both arrangements and dangers in both. Councils can be slow, factional, complacent, and excellent at making responsibility evaporate into minutes. Emperors can act decisively, unify strategy, and kill disagreement so efficiently that the realm mistakes silence for consensus. Darian's rise suggests a society impatient with its own constraints or vulnerable to a figure who promised restoration of greatness. Old empires are especially prone to such figures. They stand before faded murals and say, we can be that again. Beware anyone who points at a mural and calls it a program. A few years later, around -269, the records remember the rise of Exarch Thelisand IV, a bloodthirsty advisor associated with the increased aggression against Nicarimath. In the same darkening period appears Valigan Thirdborn, a lesser deity of anarchy within the Jhaamdathan religious landscape. The details are thorny, but the symbolism is clean enough to cut one's hand. The empire of reason, balance, and disciplined thought approached its end under the influence of anarchy, bloodlust, and imperial appetite. The irony would be intolerable if it were not so common. States rarely die by becoming the opposite of what they claimed overnight. They die by using their founding virtues to justify their opposite. Discipline becomes coercion. Reason becomes rationalization. Balance becomes expansion to restore balance. Defense becomes preemptive conquest. Serenity becomes contempt for the disorderly lives of others. The blade once carried as symbol of focused protection becomes an instrument for clearing forests. Darian's Jhaamdath built ships, many ships. The empire stripped enormous timber from the Condlewood's ancient predecessor, from the living world of Nicarimath, to build the navy by which it intended to project power into the inner sea. Every plank was political. Every felled tree was a declaration. A forest people does not experience shipbuilding as neutral industry when the forest is their home, temple, larder, memory, and shield. Think of the practical machinery of that expansion. Orders from the imperial center, surveyors identifying stands of timber, soldiers accompanying work crews, roads widened or cut, camps established, local resistance dismissed as obstruction, priests or officials explaining that the empire's destiny requires access, scribes recording quotas, laborers sweating under watch, blade lords ensuring discipline, shipwrights transforming forest into hulls, admirals inspecting future conquest, while birds vanish from a valley that had known their calls for centuries. This is how environmental consequence enters history, not as vague sadness over trees. As logistics, the Empire did not merely harm elves by killing them. It attacked the systems that allowed them to remain themselves. Forest destruction is cultural destruction when a culture's memory, worship, food, protection, and movement are forest-bound. To an imperial shipwright, a tree may be good mastwood. To a wood elf of Nycarimath, that same tree may mark a marriage, a grave, a seasonal rite, a hunting boundary, a story older than the human realm cutting it down. Maps rarely show that difference. Maps call it timber. Jhaamdath's navy achieved victories, including a remembered triumph against Westgate's fleet near Prespur. Again, note the horizon widening. The Empire was no longer content to dominate its immediate basin. It wanted the inner sea. It wanted movement, tribute, control, fear, recognition. One can almost hear the speeches. Order must be secured. Trade must be protected. Hostile powers must be preempted. The Empire has stagnated too long. The cities deserve greatness. The forests are underused. The elves are obstructive. The sea is waiting. History has many costumes, but conquest owns a limited wardrobe. The Jhaamdathan forces hunted and slaughtered elves who resisted. The old accounts do not require us to invent melodrama. The facts suffice. Nycarimath faced ruin. The elves, desperate before the prospect of annihilation, turned to high magic. Those words should chill you. Elven high magic is not a tool for convenience. It is not a tavern spell writ large. It is profound, communal, dangerous, sacrificial, and capable of altering the world. We have seen what elven high magic could achieve. Evermeet raised across the sea, mythals woven over cities, protections and transformations that shape millennia. We have also seen that beauty and consequence do not always travel separately. High magic works at the scale where intention must wrestle with the world's depth. In -255, Dala Reckoning, the year of furious waves, on Midsummer Night, according to the sharper annals, the high mages of Nycarimath called forth a colossal tidal wave from the Bay of Jhaamdath. The wave struck the 12 cities of the sword. Jhaamdath was destroyed. Do not hurry past that sentence. An empire that had endured for more than 5,000 years ended in water, not declined into irrelevance, not conquered city by city, not absorbed through marriage, treaty, and tax reform. Destroyed, the great cities inundated, streets filled, temples cracked, Eudoxias lost or shattered or drowned, blade lords swept from command into panic, scribes clutching tablets that would not matter if no one lived to read them. Commoners who had never voted for expansion dying with the officials who had ordered it. Children of Syarchs and children of dock workers learning the same final lesson at the same speed. Water is a brutal democrat when summoned at that scale. The magic reshaped the land itself. The Bay of Jhaamdath became the broader Vilhon Reach. A civilization's grave became geography. Later sailors would cross that water on errands of trade, piracy, pilgrimage, war and romance, often unaware that beneath their hulls lay the old floor of imperial certainty. This is one of Faerûn's recurring cruelties. Catastrophe becomes scenery. A fisherman teaches his son the shoals. A merchant complains about harbor fees. A pirate curses the wind. A lover watches moonlight on the waves. Beneath them are drowned avenues where people once argued about examinations, marriages, promotions, grain prices, military policy, and whether the latest imperial decree represented wise restoration or dangerous madness. The dead do not cease to be dead because the living find the view beautiful. And the wave did not strike Jhaamdath alone. Here the moral account grows more complicated. The high magic of Nikarimath, aimed against the psionic oppressors of the forest, also devastated the sea elven empire of Ariselmalir beneath the inner sea. Its capital, Coriselmal, and the structures of that underwater power were destroyed or buried by the violence and backwash of the same cataclysm. The fall of Ariselmalir helped trigger further conflict among the aquatic peoples of Seros, including the upheavals remembered in the Sixth Seros War. The defenders of one homeland shattered another empire they did not intend to destroy. This is why world-shaping magic should make the wise sweat. Intent matters morally. It does not always matter geologically. A spell designed for justice may still drown the uninvolved. A desperate act may be understandable and unforgivable in different registers. The elves of Nikarimath were not wrong to resist destruction. They were not wrong to fear Jhaamdath. They were not wrong to use power when no lesser defense remained. Yet the sea elves did not become less dead because the surface elves had cause. One may sympathize with the hand and still mourn where the blade traveled. In the aftermath, Jhaamdath's heartland became chaos. Some higher towers and keeps may have escaped immediate destruction, only to succumb later to altered waters and collapsing terrain. Isolated graveyards, outposts and distant holdings survived more fully than the cities themselves. Ruins beneath the reach remained, inaccessible to most and dangerous to those who came seeking treasures. The drowned cities acquired new inhabitants: coalinths, scrags, sea hags, and other creatures of the deep and the ruined. Psionically charged items and old artifacts are said to have leaked their influence into the environment, producing strange effects upon flora and fauna, even phrenic oddities in later accounts. Sword wraiths, spirits of the famed Jhaamdathan warriors, haunted some remnants of that martial pride. So the Empire's mind did not simply vanish, it seeped. There are horrors in that image. Not a clean death, but a leakage of disciplined will into mud, fish, stone, drowned halls, and the dreams of those foolish enough to sleep over old psychic wounds. The invisible art becomes invisible pollution. The Empire's treasured devices become hazards. Its warriors become restless dead. Its cities become lairs. Its capital becomes, in some tales, a phantom city glimpsed upon moonless nights above the water, hovering in impossible memory before vanishing again. I do not insist every sailor's tale is reliable. I do insist that drowned civilizations produce strange sailors' tales for a reason. When enough people cross a grave without knowing its name, the grave tries other methods. Openser himself was wounded by the loss. The destruction of Jhaamdath wiped out the vast majority of his worshippers and sent his faith into obscurity. A god of psionics, reason, and inner balance diminished because a civilization that had bound itself to him died in an instant. This is the divine economy, in all its unsettling intimacy. Gods shape peoples, peoples sustain gods. When states make a deity central to civic identity, they also make that deity vulnerable to civic catastrophe. One city burns, a temple weeps. 12 cities drown, a god falls into silence. This too is inheritance. Later, scions across Faerûn would exist in a world where the great human psionic tradition had been shattered. Psionics did not vanish altogether. Of course not. The mind cannot be outlawed by a wave. Duergar, illithids, certain monks, psychic warriors, strange bloodlines, aberrant inheritances, and rare human traditions preserved or manifested mental power in many forms. But the great civic center was gone. There was no Jhaamdathan equivalent of a living Netherese-descended magocracy openly boasting of continuous academic lineage. There were fragments, survivals, slumbering cults, artifacts, and the injured memory of Openser. This helps explain why Jhaamdath feels quieter than Netheril in later imagination. Arcane ruins glitter, psionic ruins listen. The immediate aftermath of Jhaamdath was not noble silence. Empires rarely leave behind tidy mourning. They leave refugees, warlords, starving soldiers, broken officials, hoarded grain, contested succession, cults, opportunists, mercenaries, local revenge, panic, plague, and children who have learned that the map can change overnight. The drowned heartland did not become peaceful because the empire was punished. Punishment is not governance. Vengeance is not administration. A wave can end a regime. It cannot build a just replacement. The remnants of Jhaamdath fell into lawlessness and violence. Here we encounter Valigan Thirdborn again, the lesser power of anarchy associated with the final convulsions of the empire and the disorder after its fall. The old Jhaamdathan pantheon did not simply vanish in one clean theological correction. Pieces remained, dangerous pieces. A broken state can become a feast for the forces it once suppressed, tolerated, misunderstood, or secretly cultivated. Do you see the pattern? The empire of reason falls, and anarchy devours its corpse. Again, irony would be comforting if it were less common. In -247 reckoning, several years after the wave, the divine campaign known as the Procession of Justice began. Tyr, god of justice, entered the lands near what would later be Allaghon in Turmish, leading a host of celestial archons to pacify the chaotic remnants of fallen Jhaamdath. Ilmater, then more obscure than later worshippers might imagine, was drawn into alliance with Tyr during this campaign, around -243. In time, these connections would form part of the deep root system behind the triad. Tyr, Ilmater, and later Torm, three lawful and good powers whose alliance shaped much of Faerûnian piety. Consider that. The fall of a psionic empire helps create the conditions under which one of Faerûn's great divine alliances rises to prominence. This is why I keep telling you, ruins are not endings. A drowned psiocracy becomes an arena for celestial justice. A local catastrophe becomes a theological hinge. A lesser deity of anarchy is destroyed in the fighting. Tyr's concern with Toril deepens. Ilmater's alliance with him takes shape. Later, paladins, judges, martyrs, penitents, healers, and oath-bound fools of varying quality inherit a divine relationship, partly forged in the wreckage of Jhaamdath. A modern priest of Tyr, raising a hand in judgment, may never think of drowned Jhaamdathan streets. The street does not need to be remembered to remain part of the foundation. Let us be careful, though. The procession of justice did not restore Jhaamdath. It pacified remnants. It crushed forces of chaos. It contributed to divine history. It did not undrown the cities or return the old schools. Justice, even when celestial, often arrives after the bodies have been counted. It may prevent worse, punish evil, and establish a new moral order, but it cannot make the dead less dead. That limitation is important, especially for those who worship justice without understanding grief. The refugees of Jhaamdath carried the empire differently than gods did. Some survivors moved north and east around the Sea of Fallen Stars into lands that later histories would know as the vast Impiltur, Thesk, the unapproachable east, and beyond. Others remained nearer the Vilhon, contributing to the eventual rise of Ilyak and later Chondath. The Chondathan peoples traced ancestry to old Jhaamdath, and their widespread across Cormyr, the Dalelands, Sembia, the Dragon Coast, the Vilhon Reach, the Pirate Isles, and other regions made them one of the most influential human ethnic groups in later Faerûn. I want you to understand the scale of that afterlife. A human merchant in Sembia calculating risk with cold practicality. A Cormyrian family name shaped by Chondathan linguistic inheritance. Settlers in the Dalelands negotiating with elven memory near the Standing Stone. Traders along the Dragon Coast. City-states of Chondath with their mercantile ambition and fractious politics. Common speech itself linked through Thoras to old Jhaamdathan and Alzedo roots. These are not Jhaamdath reborn in any simple sense. They are descendants, echoes, fragments, adaptations, misunderstandings, and continuations. Bloodline is not destiny, but it is not nothing. Language is not empire, but it carries habits. Culture is not a ghost, but it does haunt. The Chondathan inheritance is especially important because it moves us toward future episodes. The Vilhon Reach will not be finished with us tonight. Chesenta, Chondath, the city-state politics of the Reach, the Sea of Fallen Stars, Sembian ambition, Cormyrian settlement, Dalelands freedom, and the mercantile habits of wide swaths of human Faerûn all carry directly or indirectly pieces of this older human world. Jhaamdath's destruction did not remove its people from history, it scattered them. Scatter a people, and you do not erase a civilization. You make it harder to see. This is one reason the empire is overshadowed by Netheril and Imaskar. Netheril fell spectacularly and left the desert of Anoroch floating city legends named arcanists, survivor states, and ruins that tempt every ambitious wizard with a shovel and poor impulse control. Imaskar left planar theft, Mulan origins, Imaskarkana, godly intervention, and the profound drama of mortals trying to wall out deities. Jhaamdath left descendants who became ordinary. Ordinary is where history hides best. It is easier to remember a floating city than a grammar. Easier to remember stolen gods than a merchant's habit of contract. Easier to remember Karsus than the unnamed Jhaamdathan refugee who taught her children a word that would, generations later, become part of a language spoken by millions who never knew why it fit their mouths. But ordinary inheritances may be deeper than spectacular ones. The fallen enclave is a marvel. The inherited word is a climate. Now, let us return to the central thesis. Jhaamdath shows that Faerûn's great human empires were not all arcane. This matters because later realms' history is often narrated through magic as spellcraft. We speak of Netherese arcanists, elven high mages, mythals, chosen of Mystra, red wizards, Halruan skyships, Shun necromancies, Mithdrana's wards, Candlekeep's books, Thayan enclaves, and every hedge wizard whose tower threatens to explode into plot. This is understandable. Arcane magic is visible in records. It produces documents. It leaves spells behind. It also has excellent public relations, mostly because wizards write much of the material and are not known for underestimating their own importance. But psionics complicates the story. The invisible art belongs partly outside the usual arcane imagination. It is not simply another school of spellcraft. It is not merely a cleric's prayer with fewer hymns. It is the self made forceful. The mind's internal architecture becoming external consequence. In a world governed by gods, weave, pact, bloodline, rune, song, and nature, psionics says there is power in consciousness itself. This can be liberating. It can also be unbearably elitist. A slave freed by Lazic's reform may bless Alpensa's name. A common child whose gift lifts her into education may see the psiocracy as justice. A conquered laborer assigned a lower caste may understand the same system as elegant imprisonment. A blade lord may genuinely believe his mental discipline makes him a better guardian of civic order. A forest elf watching Jhaamdathan axes approach may see disciplined mind as merely a more organized appetite. All are reading the same empire from different distances. This is why the historian must distrust singular moral posture. Not because morality is meaningless, but because reality is usually crueler and more specific than slogans allow. Jhaamdath was not simply enlightened because it valued reason and abolished slavery. It was not simply monstrous because it became expansionist and slaughtered elves. It was a civilization whose ideals and institutions produced both restraint and domination. That makes it more useful to remember, not less. Monsters teach little. Civilizations teach too much. Ask what mental discipline does to daily life. A citizen may rise before dawn for focusing exercises taught through temple or household. Not every citizen, perhaps, but enough for the habit to become admired. Breath, posture, silence, internal repetition, perhaps geometric visualization, perhaps mental defense. Children might learn to still fear during examinations. Soldiers might practice blade forms while holding a single image unchanged in the mind. Scribes might train memory palaces to keep legal clauses intact before committing them to tablets or scrolls. Priests of Alpensa might teach moderation, not merely as ethical advice, but as civic hygiene. Festivals would differ too. The public celebration of a psionic culture might not be riotous excess, or it might include carefully bounded release precisely because restraint requires valves. There may have been contests of concentration, duels of blade and will, demonstrations around eudoxias, public recitations of founding precepts, ceremonial silences, civic oaths, and rites of examination. Again, much here is reasoned reconstruction rather than preserved calendar, and I mark it as such. But the shape follows from the known institutions. A people does not build its public life around mental power and then celebrate only with turnip juggling, though I do not rule out turnip juggling in the lower markets. Human nature is resilient. Crime would differ. A thief in such a society fears more than watchmen. A corrupt official learns techniques for mental concealment. Fraud becomes not only forged seal, but forged calm. Blackmail might involve knowledge obtained through unlawful intrusion or through the mere accusation of it. Illegal teachers of psionics could become dangerous figures. Untaxed artifacts, illicit focusing crystals, foreign techniques, cultic mental practices, and anti-psionic disciplines would all have value. A society that elevates one kind of power creates markets in its shadows. Medicine would differ. Pain control, trauma, madness, memory, compulsion, and phobia would all be understood through different tools. A healer trained in the invisible art might soothe agony, discipline panic, or help a soldier survive shock. The same techniques could be used to force endurance beyond mercy. An empire that can make pain negotiable may become compassionate, or it may become better at extracting labor and loyalty. Education would differ. The gifted are always a problem for states. Ignore them, and they become unpredictable. Train them, and they become ambitious. Suppress them, and they become martyrs or monsters. Jhaamdath's institutions gave a formal pathway for the psionically gifted, but formal pathways also decide which gifts are legitimate. A child whose talent did not fit approved disciplines might be considered defective, dangerous, or spiritually imbalanced. A foreign psionic tradition might be absorbed, dismissed, or persecuted, depending on whether officials could translate it into Jhaamdathan categories. Marriage would differ. Do not laugh. Marriage is one of Empire's quieter administrative tools. If psionic talent is valued, families will consider it. Alliances among psiarch houses may seek strength of discipline, lineage of training, proximity to institutions, favor from temple and council. A commoner with great talent may become desirable in ways that disturb caste comfort. A noble without talent may need strategic marriage to preserve status. Conquered peoples may be folded into the empire through marriage policies that look generous in celebratory record and coercive in family memory. Military colonization would differ. A Jhaamdathan outpost is not merely wall and garrison. It is a mental extension of the center. It brings exercises, rites, hierarchy, legal procedure, language, and perhaps artifacts. It trains local auxiliaries. It classifies local talents. It teaches children that the empire's order is the road to advancement. It punishes resistance as disorder. Over generations, a conquered settlement may become sincerely Jhaamdathan in speech and aspiration, while still preserving old songs in kitchens and hill rites. This is how empires endure without burning everything. They teach the grandchildren of the conquered to desire the conqueror's examinations. If that sentence made you uncomfortable, keep it. It is doing useful work. Now consider the forest elves of Nycerimath within this frame. From the Jhaamdathan side, the forest may have seemed economically necessary, strategically inconvenient, and culturally resistant. Its people did not fit the imperial order. They did not arrange themselves according to Jhaamdathan castes. Their relationship to land, magic, memory, and authority would have seemed alien to a psionic urban state. Their refusal of incorporation could be framed as irrational hostility. Their defense of trees could be framed as obstruction of progress. Their elven longevity and high magic could be framed as dangerous privilege. Their refusal to submit could be transformed in imperial rhetoric into proof that they must be subdued. From the elven side, the humans were short-lived, hungry, disciplined in a way that made them more dangerous, and multiplying their appetite through institutions. They did not merely raid, they planned. They did not merely cut, they built fleets. They did not merely trespass, they converted trespass into policy. They brought a mental art alien to elven high magic and insisted that their ordered society had a claim upon forest life. Conflict between such cultures is not inevitable in the cosmic sense, but it becomes increasingly likely when one side needs the other's homeland for its next phase of greatness. The wave, then, was not a freak event detached from history. It was the final sentence in a long argument over land, power, fear, and the scale of acceptable defense. Jhaamdath made itself intolerable. Nikerimath made itself catastrophic. And the Vilhon was born from both. This is why the modern shape of the Reach is morally charged. It is not merely water between ports. It is a wound filled by the sea. Later merchant cities, pirate havens, fishing villages, temple towns, and border disputes all occur around a basin whose current form is the result of high magic used in war. The region's later tendency towards city-state rivalry, mercantile ambition, militarized trade, and sudden catastrophe is not caused solely by Jhaamdath, of course. Geography, resources, peoples, gods, roads, and later choices matter. But the founding trauma matters. A region born from a drowned empire learns to treat prosperity as precarious, even when it cannot remember why. The Vilhon Reach becomes, in later eras, a place of city-states, trade, wine, stone, fish, horses, slaves in some periods, mercenaries, competing faiths, and political fragmentation. The old Jhaamdathan central order does not return. Instead, its descendants and inheritors produce other models. Chondathan mercantile habits, Chondath's confederations, Chesantan martial pride, Turmish's particular civic traditions, Cispakian tensions, independent ports, and the endless negotiation of wealth and walls. That is for future episodes. Tonight, it is enough to note that the Reach's later life is not a clean replacement, but a field of descendants arguing over a drowned grammar. Let us speak plainly about Jhaamdath's destruction as environmental consequence. The wave did not only kill people, it remade hydrology, coastline, settlement patterns, trade routes, aquatic politics, forest boundaries, and ruin distribution. It changed where ships could sail, where fish spawned, where refugees fled, where later ports might rise, where roads became useless, where old walls became reefs, where magical residue entered ecosystems, where monsters laired, and where legends attached themselves to water. A single act of high magic, born of desperation and wrath, became a long-term environmental system. This should sound familiar. Faerûn's history repeatedly shows that magic at scale is not merely an event. It is infrastructure for the future, whether anyone intended to build it. The first sundering raised Evermeet and wounded the world in ways that echoed millennia. Netherill's fall created deserts, survivor states, magical prohibitions, and a permanent terror of arcanist overreach. The spell plague later rewrote lands, bodies, nations, and assumptions. The Second Sundering restored much and did not restore innocence. Jhaamdath's destruction belongs in that lineage of transformations where the map becomes testimony. This is why Irillian Cantonine is so tiresome about maps. A map without memory is an accessory to trespass. Now, the legal claim of ruins. Who owns drowned Jhaamdath? The dead, their descendants, the Condathans, the elves whose high magic destroyed it, the sea creatures dwelling there now, the local powers who control nearby waters, the priests of Alpensa, if any can prove devotional continuity, the scholars who can read the old language, the adventurers who risk drowning, the fishermen whose nets snag on old balconies, the ghosts who object with swords. Do not answer too quickly. A ruin as memory belongs to those whose history it carries. A ruin as treasure is claimed by whoever can reach it, which is why treasure ethics so often resemble theft with better boots. A ruin as legal claim depends on surviving institutions, and Jhaamdath's central institutions drowned. A ruin as hazard belongs to whoever suffers its consequences. A ruin as sacred site belongs to the gods, the dead, and the living communities who continue to honor it. A ruin as opportunity belongs to ambition. Most disputes over ruins begin when different claim types speak past one another. The scholar says, preserve. The descendant says, mourn. The ruler says, regulate. The merchant says, recover. The priest says, sanctify. The adventurer says, detect magic. The ghost says, leave. The ghost is not always wrong. Jhaamdath's ruins complicate each claim because they are submerged, dangerous, and psychically contaminated by old power. Accessibility affects morality. A ruin under a city invites daily relationship. A ruin beneath hostile waters becomes legend, then prize. Those who risk descent may believe risk grants ownership. This is a common adventurer's fallacy. Difficulty of theft does not make theft restoration. Yet danger does matter. If a drowned artifact leaks harmful influence into the Reach, retrieval or sealing may become public good. If sword wraiths rise from old battlefields, priests and warriors may have duties beyond scholarship. A good inheritor must ask, what is needed here? Remembrance, protection, recovery, containment, repentance, or refusal. A bad inheritor asks, what is it worth? Jhaamdath attracts bad inheritors precisely because its power was unusual. Psionic artifacts are rare. The thought of an Eudoxia or similar relic surviving in a sealed chamber beneath the Reach is enough to unhinge collectors, wizards who should know better, scions seeking lineage, tyrants seeking advantage, and scholars who insist curiosity is morally neutral because they have not yet met the bill. The invisible art's lost infrastructure tempts those who imagine themselves wiser than the drowned. The drowned are often wiser than they appear. They have at least stopped making new mistakes. Let us draw the comparison with Netheril more sharply, because later this season we will return to the Arcanists and their floating cities. Netheril externalized magic. It made cities fly. It built mythallars, turned spellcraft into civic energy, and trained arcanists to believe the world was a set of principles awaiting exploitation. Its arrogance rose into the sky and then fell very literally. Jhaamdath internalized power. It made the trained mind the foundation of rank and governance. It built not upward through levitation, but inward through discipline, and outward through institutions shaped by that discipline. Netheril asks, what happens when magic becomes infrastructure? Jhaamdath asks, what happens when self-mastery becomes government? Both are dangerous questions. The Netherese failure is easier for most folk to understand because a falling city makes an excellent cautionary image. The Jhaamdathan failure is subtler. The mind does not fall from the sky. It persuades itself, it explains, it classifies, it stills doubt, it decides the forest is disorder, it decides conquest is restoration, it decides hierarchy is balance, it decides the wave could not possibly come. Then the water arrives. I do not wish you to leave this episode believing Jhaamdath's fall proves that psionics is inherently corrupting. That would be lazy. Psionics is power. Power reveals and amplifies the ethical structures built around it. The invisible art can heal, defend, enlighten, liberate, communicate, and discipline fear. It can also dominate, intrude, stratify, rationalize, and make conquest feel calm. The problem is not thought made powerful. The problem is thought made powerful without humility before other forms of life. A mind can be brilliant and still provincial. A society can train concentration and still misunderstand a forest. A ruler can perceive intention and still fail to perceive consequence. This is one of Jhaamdath's enduring lessons for later Faerûn. The highest form of intelligence in politics is not cleverness. It is not even discipline. It is the ability to recognize that other peoples are real before they become obstacles. Jhaamdath failed that test. Nikerimath passed it only partly and at terrible cost. Arisel Malir paid for both. When I say the destruction of Jhaamdath matters long after the empire is gone, this is what I mean. It matters linguistically through Old Chondathan and the roots of later human speech. It matters ethnically and culturally through Chondathan-descended peoples spread across heartlands, coasts, and trade networks. It matters geographically because the Vilhon reach itself is shaped by the cataclysm. It matters religiously because Alpensa was diminished and the procession of justice helped draw Tyr and Ilmater into a lasting pattern of alliance. It matters politically because the Reach's later city-state world grows on ground and water transformed by imperial death. It matters adventurously, if you insist on the term, because drowned ruins containing strange artifacts, psychic residues, undead warriors, and unclear claims remain irresistible to the brave, the desperate, and the insufficiently supervised. It also matters philosophically. Faerûn's history is often narrated as a contest between magic and morality. Jhaamdath reminds us that mental discipline does not solve the moral problem. A calm conqueror is still a conqueror. A rationalized atrocity is still an atrocity. A caste system, explained through reason, is still a caste system. A reforming empire can become predatory without ceasing to remember its reforms. A society can abolish slavery and later commit mass violence. A people can be oppressed and respond with power that destroys the uninvolved. No one in this story is permitted the luxury of becoming a slogan. The archive resists slogans. That is why so many slogans resent archives. Let us spend a moment with the common Jhaamdath at the end, because empires are too often killed twice. First, in fact, then in summary. Imagine a scribe in Corinth cataloguing naval requisitions and privately worrying that the timber numbers are unsustainable. He is loyal, not foolish. He has a brother in the fleet. He has heard rumors of elven ambushes and worse rumors of what imperial troops do afterward. He writes the figures cleanly because figures written cleanly are the difference between policy and accusation. Imagine a soldier from an outer province, imported into the imperial army, proud of his pay, tired of Psyarch contempt, repeating focus exercises before sleep because they help with fear, even if he does not love the men who taught him. He has never seen the capital, he has seen the forest burn. Imagine a priest of Orpenser who genuinely believes moderation can restrain the emperor's new appetite, who preaches balance to a congregation where officials listen politely and do nothing. The priest's God is real, his doctrine is noble, his influence is insufficient. Imagine a shipwright whose craft is excellent, whose children eat because the navy expands, who knows every keel laid down means another stand of old trees gone, and who has learned not to ask whether the forest screams. Imagine an elven scout of Nikarimath, watching the roads widen, counting stumps, finding bodies, reporting to elders who remember human generations as brief and therefore once hoped the problem would pass. It does not pass. It organizes. Imagine a sea elf far below, in Ariselmalir's world, concerned with entirely different politics, unaware that a surface war is preparing to send disaster through the water column and bury the future. Imagine a child in the first city of the sword, proud because she has moved a pebble with her mind for the first time. She runs to tell her mother. Perhaps there is laughter, perhaps there is fear, perhaps the family thinks she may rise. Then the wave. History must be able to hold the child's pebble and the empire's crime in the same hand. If it cannot, it is not history. It is prosecution or propaganda. The dead deserve better than propaganda, even when some of the dead belonged to a guilty civilization. There is one more irony, and we shall not leave it unopened. Jhaamdath's patron, Orpenser, was associated with personal autonomy as well as reason and serenity. In its best light, the invisible art is profoundly personal. Power arising from selfhood rather than bestowed office, inherited blood, or external formula. Yet Jhaamdath turned that inward power into a stratified public order. Personal autonomy became civic hierarchy. The mind's freedom became the state's measure of worth. This is not unique. Many traditions begin by freeing the person and end by classifying persons according to how well they perform the freedom prescribed. A monastic discipline becomes a ranking system. A revolutionary law becomes a bureaucracy. A merchant's liberty becomes debt peonage. A kingdom founded to protect villages becomes a throne that taxes them dry. The problem is not that ideals are false. The problem is that ideals require guardians against their own institutional success. Who guarded Orpenser's balance from Jhaamdathan pride? Not enough. Who guarded Nikarimath's defense from catastrophic overreach? Not enough. Who guarded Ariselmalir from surface consequences? No one who mattered in time. This is the sound history makes when every party has a reason and none has enough humility. As we move through this season, remember Jhaamdath, whenever a later realm claims its model of order, will solve the world's older griefs. Mulhorand will claim divine order. Unther will claim divine kingship of a harsher flavor. Kalimshan will claim urban antiquity, wealth, and mastery over inherited elemental fire. Shun will claim imperial administration. Amn will claim coin's practical wisdom. Cormyr will claim lawful crown and institutional restraint. The Dales will claim local freedom. They will claim magical expertise as governance. Aglarond will claim refusal. Each will be partly right. Each will be tempted to confuse partial truth with title to the world. Jhaamdath's partial truth was this: the mind matters. Discipline matters. Reason matters. A civilization that trains thought may achieve wonders impossible to peoples ruled only by appetite. Its fatal error was this: disciplined thought does not grant ownership of everything it can analyze. The forest was not a problem set. The elves were not disorder. The sea was not empty. The future was not obligated to admire the Empire's self-control. And now, because I am a creature of archives and therefore professionally allergic to neat endings, let us ask what remains to be done with Jhaamdath in the present imagination of Faerûn. First, we must restore it to the map of memory, not by exaggerating it into a psionic utopia or a villain realm made of polished cruelty, but by admitting it as one of humanity's great early experiments. It deserves a place beside Netheril and Immerskar in any serious account of human ambition. Its power was different, its evidence quieter, its afterlife more linguistic and cultural than spectacular, but its importance is not lesser. Second, we must remember the Vilhon Reach as a place shaped by catastrophe before later political identities arose. When later Chondath, Turmish, Sespech, Chesenta and surrounding powers maneuver around the Reach, they do so upon a coastline born from high magic and imperial death. The water is not neutral. No water in Faerûn is entirely neutral. But the Villion is especially eloquent if one has the patience to hear drowned streets beneath commerce. Third, we must resist the romance of lost mental power. There will always be those who hear of Jhaamdath and imagine only the recovered Eudoxia, the psionic blade, the forgotten discipline, the lost school, the artifact that might make them exceptional. There is nothing wrong with seeking knowledge. I am, despite appearances, somewhat in favor of it. But knowledge stripped from consequence is merely another form of looting. If you would recover Jhaamdath, recover also Nikarimath, Arisel Malir, Alpence's silence, the refugees, the later Condathan spread, and the procession of justice. Take the whole inheritance, or admit you came only for treasure. Fourth, we must understand that Jhaamdath's destruction is not an argument for passivity. The elves of Nikarimath faced existential danger. Peoples have the right to defend themselves, but the episode warns that power at world-shaping scale cannot be morally measured only by intent. The wave was aimed at oppressors and struck the uninvolved. This does not erase the oppression. It does not absolve Jhaamdath. It does not condemn all resistance. It demands that we stop speaking of catastrophic magic as if righteousness gives it borders. Righteousness has never been an adequate containment circle. Fifth, we must recognize that the descendants of empire are not identical with empire. Jhaamdathan peoples are not guilty of Jhaamdath by blood, nor are they free of inheritance simply because they did not choose it. Their languages, migrations, trade habits, regional identities, and political patterns carry forward echoes. That is how ancestry works when treated honestly. It is neither shackles nor absolution. It is material. What you build from material is where responsibility enters. The candles are guttering now, and the shelf seems less reluctant than when we began. Or perhaps I am less willing to let its reluctance determine the evening. The ledgers smell faintly of salt. I dislike that. No archive should smell of the sea unless someone has made several questionable choices in storage. Yet for Jhaamdath, perhaps it is fitting. The Empire's records belong to dampness, to warped bindings, to ghostly ink, to the sense that words have been recovered from below rather than merely copied from one dry shelf to another. I run one finger along a line of old names. Dinilith, Narcolith, Poranath, Juram, Garant, Golmuth, Lirimar, Tuoxant, Holinth, Girent, Inixian, Corant, Mirindith. The dust does not answer. It rarely does when one wants it to. But if you listen beneath the city above, beneath the carts, bells, boots, shutters, prayers, quarrels, knives, lullabies, contracts, and all the warm, mortal clamour that makes history worth preserving, despite its behaviour, you may hear something like water moving through stone, not the sea itself. Memory imitating tide. Before we close, ask yourself these questions, my apprentice. If a civilization builds its greatness from disciplined thought, does that make it wiser or merely more efficient at explaining its desires? When reason becomes hierarchy, who decides which minds are balanced enough to rule? If an empire abolishes one cruelty and later commits another, how should memory hold gratitude and condemnation together without allowing either to erase the other? When a desperate people uses catastrophic power to prevent its own destruction, how far does justice travel with the wave? And where does consequence begin to accuse it? Who owns a drowned ruin? The descendants of those who built it, the peoples harmed by it, the creatures now living within it, the gods who lost worship there, or the future that must survive what leaks from it. And when you speak a language, walk a coast, sail a reach, or trade in a city whose habits come from histories you never learned, what are you inheriting without knowing its name? If you wish to continue walking these shelves between episodes, the archive at taleofthelich.com is live. There you will find the growing record of our long argument with forgetfulness, timelines, commentary, episode materials, and whatever other forms of ordered memory the living have persuaded the dead to maintain in a format less flammable than parchment. I remain suspicious of progress, but I concede that searchable pages have certain advantages over apprentices wandering 3 hours through the wrong corridor because someone filed psionic catastrophe under regional hydrology. Merch is coming soon as well. Yes, the old sentence remains strange. Somewhere in the future, a mortal may drink coffee from a vessel bearing a phrase about drowned Siocracies, or wear a garment reminding strangers that the map is not empty. I have decided to interpret this as public education rather than commerce, which is what all commerce hopes to be called when the candles are lit flatteringly. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. For clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If your work requires a structure that can carry meaning without collapsing beneath its own ambition, seek craftsmen who understand that design is not decoration and maintenance is not an afterthought. I have watched empires forget both principles. The invoices were impressive, the ruins were worse. Next time we travel east and south into the long legacy of the Mulan peoples, to Mulhorand and Unther, where divinity did not remain a distant matter of hymns and metaphysics. There, gods became government, temples became administration, ritual became law. The state did not merely claim divine blessing. In old and complicated ways, it was shaped by divine presence. If Jhaamdath asks what happens when the mind becomes the basis of empire, Mulhorand and Unther ask what happens when gods sit too near the tax office. A cheerful subject, as always. Until then, keep your candles trimmed, your thoughts disciplined but not enthroned, and your maps annotated wherever water may be concealing a civilization's last argument. I am Aurelian Cantonine. This has been the Lich's tale. And remember, ruin is not the same as forgetting.